Still Rebels, Still Yankees by Donald Davidson. At a meeting of Southern writers in Charleston during the autumn of 1932, Lawrence Stallings looked belligerently around him and expressed an ardent preference for a balkanized America. "What I like about Charleston," he said, "is that it has resisted Abraham Lincoln's attempts to put the country into arrow collars. If the South had won the war, the country would have had lots more color." The rebelliousness of Mr. Stallings need not compel us to suspect him of being an unreconstructed Southerner disguised as a man of letters, who was looking for artistic reasons to justify what arms and politics once failed to secure. Discontent with the uniformity of America is common enough. What is not common is the knowledge that this uniformity, a byword ever since James Bryce looked at the American Commonwealth through the spectacles of the Gilded Age, is more a myth than a reality. As a myth, it probably represents the wishful thinking of those who, for their own designs, want America to become uniform. Actually, America is not yet uniform. Very likely it is less uniform than it was, and far more balkanized than Mr. Stallings dreams. The unreconstructed Southerners have done their part in keeping it Balkan, but there are unreconstructed Yankees, too, and other unreconstructed Americans of all imaginable sorts, everywhere engaged in preserving their local originality and independence. The only people who do not know this are certain experts who do most of the current talking about American society. They live in a sociological pickle of statistics and progress. They are eternally looking for what they call social values, but they strangely confine their research to libraries and graduate projects at the larger universities. They avoid the places where social values may be encountered in the flesh. If they stumble upon a living social value, walking visibly about some spot of earth and drawing its nutriment from a tradition embodied in the houses, speech, crafts, music, folklore, and wisdom of an actual people, their rule is to denounce it as an anachronism and to call for its extermination. For them, nothing must grow according to its nature, but things develop by laboratory formulas, which are obtained by inspecting the reactions of the most abnormal and depressed specimens of humankind, too weak to protest against sociological vivisection. Those of us who still believe in the map of the United States know that it marks the residence of some diverse Americans who had better not go unacknowledged. In Vermont, for instance, are people who are still Yankees, and in Georgia and elsewhere there are still rebels. I remember talking with a certain Virginian who watched a Vermont sunset with me one summer evening. As the sun passed below the distant Adirondacks, we looked at the green mountains around us and at the trim Vermont fields, where all the weeds were flowers and all the grass was hay. In the clear detail of the afterglow, we saw the forests of spruce and balsam and maple, and spoke of how the very wilderness in this New England state had uprightness and order. The woods were as snug and precise as a Yankee kitchen. No ragged edges, no sprawling, nothing out of place. In the clearings, the farmhouses were all painted, and the barns were painted too. The streams were orthodox streams, almost model streams, with water always translucent and stones rounded and picturesquely placed among moss and ferns. They were often called brooks, a word that for Southerners existed only on the printed page. On this land, the Virginians said, the Yankees had looked so intimately and long that, like the man in Hawthorne's story of the Great Stone Face, they had become the image of what they contemplated. The Yankee genius of Vermont was upright, vertical, and no doubt Puritan. Where the landscape itself enforced consistency and order, how could the people concede much virtue to inconsistency and irregularity? The forebears of the Vermont Yankee had once failed to understand how Southerners could be devoted both to slavery and to democracy. That old failure of understanding did not seem queer or worth more than a passing sigh to two Southerners who stood looking at sunset upon a land whose gentled wildness suggested the urgent possibility of a well ordered universe, cut to a discrete Yankee pattern. But the human geography of America had now become a party colored thing, sprawling across the continent in a crazy quilt of provinces or sections, each with its private notion of the universe. No longer, as in the 60s, could the Yankee make bold to set up a general pattern for the entire Union. He had enough to do if he would defend and preserve what was peculiarly his very own, surely in Upper New England. In such a purpose of preservation, the two Southerners at last could make bold to sympathize, even to help if possible. But preservation could not be achieved without recognizing a principle of diversity in American life. Only by such means could one make any sense out of Lamar's famous epigram in his eulogy of Sumner: "My countrymen, know one another, and you will love one another." It ceased to have meaning if America was to be subjugated to the ideal of uniformity, or to the ideal universe that some one section might generate. But how could the principle of diversity be inculcated? On the negative side, certain false images, the product of legend or propaganda, must somehow be counterbalanced. To the Virginian, I recalled the horror of a good lady from the Middle West who was motoring from Washington to Richmond. Mount Vernon was all right, she thought. There the legend was safely frozen. But beyond, on the road to Richmond, what had become of all the great mansions that she had read about? The cotton fields with the Negroes caroling, the old gentlemen in goatees and white vests, sipping mint juleps in the shade. They were not visible. There were only a few scattered shacks and tumble-down barns and miles of impenetrable wilderness that looked for all the world as it must have looked when John Smith first invaded it. If she could have encountered the legend, the lady would have been content. But not seeing it, or knowing how to locate it, she was smitten with a housewifely desire to get at this ragged land with a good broom and whisk it into seemliness. Other sojourners have been anxious to do far more drastic tidying up. The Harlan County visitors, the Scottsboro attorneys, the shock troops of Dayton and Gastonia asked no questions about the genius of place. Wherever they went on their missions of social justice, they carried with them a legend of the future, more dangerously abstract than the legend of the past, and sternly demanded that the local arrangements be made to correspond with it at whatever cost. The local arrangements, indeed, might bear mending, and yet the only America that the visitors offered as a model was an overgrown urban America, forever in process of becoming one laboratory experiment after another. What could be done about all this? Our answers were shrouded in darkness as we walked back to the log fires and good company of a New England inn. The Virginian, after the fashion of good Southerners who did not want to let anybody know the uncertainty of their minds under modern conditions, did not propose any answer. Instead, he told several good stories. They were his courteous and delightful way of saying that he was being pounded between his own unyielding loyalty and the howling respectability of the great world. 2. If any answer is to be found, if anything positive is to be done, it must surely be through the laborious process of discovering America all over again. When one looks at America, not to see how it does or does not fit the synthetic ideals proposed for its future, but only with the modest purpose of detecting the realities, let us say the social values, that persist in local habitations, he soon realizes that comparisons are more fruitful than condemnations. More specifically, when one has had the good fortune to go directly from a summer in Vermont to an autumn and winter in Middle Georgia, he forms a clear picture of sectional differences. This picture is not in the least favorable to the notion that the diverse America of the rebels and Yankees is in any immediate danger of being submerged. If on coming to Vermont I had consulted the modern legend of New England that vaguely haunted my mind, I would have received the iconoclastic shock which our advanced thinkers argue is the first step toward salvation. Had not a New England migrant to the south assured me that his ancestral acres were now inhabited by Montenegrins who had turned them into a goat farm? Had not the sepulchral Eugene O'Neill and others told tales of the poverty and decadence of New England life? The farms were deserted, it was said. The immigrants and mill towns had come. The Yankees had left for parts unknown, or remaining had become degenerate. Even the loyalty of Robert Frost gave no comfortable assurance, if one accepted the New York Alec's criticism of north of Boston, though there were many wishful asides in which Frost put forth the guarded wisdom of a not yet daunted soul. The New England of Whittier and Webster was supposed to be extinct. It had been replaced by Puritan baiters and F. Scott Fitzgeraldites, who drank cocktails and read Proust when not conducting the insurance business of the United States. But if the Vermont that I saw was in the least representative of New England, this composite picture was a wild distraction. In Vermont, if nowhere else, a New England like that of Whittier and Webster miraculously persisted, a reality capable of reducing a Southerner almost to despairing envy. I could understand what led Walter Hines Page, a quarter of a century ago, to disparage his native North Carolina and fall in love with New England. But the time was past when one needed to disparage or praise, in the interests of the America Page dreamed about, for in the 1930s it seemed impossible of realization, or where realized, already past saving. To one who did not accept Lincoln's quaint idea that the United States must become, quote, all one thing or all the other, it seemed more than ever true that the unity of America must rest, first of all, on a decent respect for sectional differences. If Vermont and Georgia could be taken in a broad way to stand for New England and the Deep South, one could easily trace out the most general differences. The Vermont towns, like the Vermont landscape, were swept and garnished, as if the day of judgment might at any moment summon them into the presence of the celestial inspector. They looked as if Vermonters lived by the adage, handsome is handsome does, and one could reflect that this proverb might well have issued from some collaborative effort of Poor Richard and Jonathan Edwards. The most delightful of Southern towns was almost certain to mix a little squalor with its grandeurs. Here, what a Southerner most particularly noticed was the neatly painted aspects of everything, the absence of ramshackle buildings and litter, the white steeples of churches, the ship-shapeness of streets, yards, garages, barber shops, and public buildings. By some special benison of God and the New England conscience, not a billboard had been allowed to sprout between Bennington and the Canadian border. Perhaps by the same double grace, not a weed sprouted either. All the weeds had turned into ferns and buttercups. Vermont farms were Currier and Ives' prints of what good farms ought to look like, with orchards and brooks in exactly the right places, and gates that did not need mending. In the background were lakes and mountains where one would put them if he were Aladdin or Wordsworth. it was not surprising to be told that hardly a poison snake and little or no poison ivy existed in the state of Vermont, or to find that there were excellent trails running the whole length of the Green Mountains, with finger posts at every wilderness crossroads, and tin huts with beds, firewood, and caretaker atop of the highest peaks. A few nagging irregularities of nature, like black flies and mosquitoes, seemed really blasphemous in a land to which God had given a monopoly of all things good and precise. No wonder, with all this beneficence around them, that the Yankees remembered the Mayflower and forgot John Smith, honored Bunker Hill, and neglected Kings Mountain. If they could claim such priority in the beneficence of God, their proprietary feeling toward the Revolutionary War and their once almost hereditary claim to the direction of the United States government were, by comparison, insignificant appurtenances, theirs as a matter of course, and by general presumption. Although I did not hold very devotedly to the economic determinism of modern historians, it was a temptation to say that the people were a great deal like the land. There was the climate, which put keenness into a southerner's veins. Summer was short, and one had to make the most of it. Winter was severe, and one had to keep shield and buckler perpetually ready against it. In that matter, was God benevolent or ruthless? Short summers and cold winters made the Vermont Yankee frugal and careful. He must watch his corners. If he were caught napping, he would perish. So much and no more was the gift of his seasons. So much and no more was the rule of his nature. And one had to watch over his neighbor as well as work with him, if the general security were not to be imperiled by some outrageous letting down of bars. Very likely, the New England civic conscience derived as much from the imperatives of climate as from the Puritan tradition. The one egged on the other. No great check had ever been put upon the development of qualities that the Southerner recognized as ineradicably Yankee. History had been kind to the Yankee, as God had been kind. Since Revolutionary times, no great sudden change had ever swept over these peaceful towns and this quiet landscape. Industrialism had come slowly and somewhat agreeably upon a people who had the ingenuity to use it and the moral force to make it behave. How could they who thought they knew how to tame the monster realize that he might walk unshackled and ravening elsewhere? The Yankees, indeed, had never tasted defeat. Since Burgoyne's expedition, no invader had come upon them to ravage and destroy. They had freed the Negroes, replying, "I can," to duties, "Thou must." But they were fortunately exempt from the results of emancipation, for no Negroes lived among them to acquaint them with the disorder of unashamed and happy dirt. One knew that a slum in New England would be a well-managed slum, and that New Englanders would comprehend Secretary Perkins' horror at the lack of plumbing in unreformed America, and her notion of saving the barefoot South by building shoe factories. For in New England, humanitarianism was the natural flower of good sense. In a land where everything was so right, it was hard to imagine a perverse land where so much could be so wrong without disturbing either a people's composure or their happiness. But in the plantation country of Middle Georgia, the social values required a different yardstick. The genius of Georgia was stretched out, relaxed, and easy, in keeping with the landscape, which required a large and horizontal view of mundane affairs. The Georgian assumed that God would have sense and heart enough to take into consideration, when Judgment Day came around, a good deal besides external and man-made appearances. God was a gentleman, indeed, who would certainly know without being told that one was a person, a somebody, doing his best among some rather amazing arrangements that had better not be talked about too much. The climate might or might not predispose the Georgia rebel to laziness. The fact was, he worked and fretted more than the Yankee knew. But the rebel idea was never to seem to work and fret. You must not let your work ride you, was the saying. In plain truth, you did not need to. The land was bountiful, and the Lord would provide, and in event of the Lord's failure or displeasure, you could always fall back on your kinfolks. Where the seasons were all mixed up so that autumn merged into spring without any sharp demarcation, and you might have a dubious summer in the middle of winter, it became almost a point of honor not to worry too much about provision. There was no need to watch corners when something was growing all the time. Almost anything would grow in Middle Georgia, and almost everything did grow, including weeds, whose invasions could not possibly be repelled from every roadside and ditch if they were to be kept out of cotton and corn. The Georgia landscape had a serene repose that lulled a man out of all need and conscience. It was anything but swept and garnished. It could be either mild or majestic, or genial or savage, depending on what view you got of pines against red earth, or Negro cabins underneath their chinaberry trees, or sedge grass running into gullies and thence to impenetrable swamps, or deserted mansions lost in oak groves and magnolias. Rivers were muddy and at times unrestrained. They got out of bounds, as all things natural did here. In the pine barrens, you might get the impression of desolation and melancholy, but things could grow lushly too. With the overpowering vegetable passion that harrowed the Puritan soul of Amy Lowell when she visited the Magnolia Gardens at Charleston. But finally, it was a well-tilled country, where you were forever seeing the Negro and his mule against the far horizon, or the peach orchards bursting into an intoxicating pink. The seasons were full of charms and intimidations. Spring, with its dogwood blossoms and soft airs, might deliver a tornado or a flood. Summer, full of grown corn and harvest ease, might turn into dusty drouth. The woods that lured you to enter and gave nuts and flowers for the taking were full of hidden terrors. Sit on a mossy bank without precaution, and in a few hours you might be on fire with chigger bites. Stoop to pick a flower, and you might find a rattlesnake. Indoors, the housewife had to fight cockroaches and flies. Outdoors were hawks, weasels, possums, coons, and such varmints that harry the henhouse. Precision for the Georgian must rank among the utopian virtues. If New England encouraged man to believe in an ordered universe, Georgia, and a good deal of the South besides, compelled him to remember that there were snakes in Eden. Nature, so ingratiating and beautiful, which bound the Georgian to his land with a love both possessive and fearful, was a fair but dreadful mistress, unpredictable and uncontrollable as God. The New Englander knew exactly where to find nature harsh and nature yielding, and he could make his arrangements accordingly. But the Georgian never knew. His safest policy was to relax, and he readily developed a great deal of tolerance for irregularity in nature and man. At his lowest level, this quality made him lackadaisical and trifling. In this he differed from the New England Yankee, who became a perfectionist, and then, at his worst, might turn into a zealot, strangely intolerant, even while, as idealist, he argued for tolerance. History, like God and nature, had been both generous and unkind to Georgia and the South. The Georgia rebel must approach his early history through a bloody link of war and Reconstruction that was hazy and bygone to the Vermont Yankee. Defeat had possessed him and rubbed deep into his wounds. Around him were the visible reminders of destruction and humiliation. His land had been ravaged and rebuilt, and he had been told to forget. But he would not and could not forget, and was therefore torn between his loyalty and his awareness that the great world was bored with his not forgetting. He had been rebuked for seeming inept at administrating a newfangled government that he did not understand or like any too well, and in which he had been allowed to participate only by a kind of negligent afterthought. Turning desperately to the industrial civilization against which he had once taken arms, he had played it as a hedge against the problematic future. Though agrarian at heart, he had been forced to wonder whether the ingenious Yankee might not be right after all. Thus he remembered the faith and hankered after the flesh pots at the same time. But industrialism, declining to be treated as a mere hedge, began Sherman's march to the sea all over again. It piled ugliness upon wreckage and threw the old arrangements out of kilter. The United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Kiwanis Club flourished side by side. Mule wagon and automobile, fundamentalism and liberalism, education and illiteracy, aristocratic pride and backwoods independence, disproved the axiom that two bodies cannot occupy the same space. Cities that preserved the finest flavor of the old regime had to be approached over brand new roads where billboards, filling stations, and factories broke out in a modernistic rash among the water oaks and Spanish moss. And everywhere was the Negro, a cheerful, grinning barnacle tucked away in all the tender spots of Southern life, not to be removed without pain, not to be cherished without tragedy. The Georgian, when reproached for his intolerance, told himself that actually nobody outdid him in fond tolerance of the Negro. Lynchings, the work of hotheads and roustabouts, were regrettable, but what did a few lynchings count in the balance against the continual forbearance and solicitude that the Georgian felt he exercised towards the amiable children of cannibals, whose skins, by no conceivable act of Congress or educational program, could be changed from black to white? The presence of the Negro, which had its advantages in agriculture and domestic service, made the Georgian's life both comfortable and ramshackle. It gave him devoted servants and social problems, cheap labor and hideous slums, an endless flow of folklore and anecdote, and eternal apprehension for the future. But in his own way, the Georgian respected the Negro as another irregularity, taking a human and personal form that had somehow to be lived with. He distrusted all ready-made prescriptions for bringing about regularity. In Georgia, life went along horizontally. You never crossed a bridge until you came to it, and maybe not then. 3. But sociologists not only cross bridges, they build all imaginable kinds of new ones. The picture of America as sociologically reformed does not contemplate any great concession to Yankee uprightness or rebel relaxation. Indeed, the sociologist, armed with science, is ready to follow reformation with transformation. In the vast inevitable working of the social forces, sectional differences become irrelevant. With a cold smile, the sociologist pronounces a death sentence upon rebel and Yankee alike. Not that they matter very much, but they will have to yield. When he talks like this, I am perversely compelled to remember the individuals I have seen, Brother Jonathan of Vermont and Cousin Roderick of Georgia, whom I cannot imagine as yielding to the puny weapons flourished by our social philosophers. They are local incarnations of the old Adam. They are the immovable bodies that can furnish the irresistible social forces with an incalculable meeting. They are human beings, undebatably alive, and they are different. Brother Jonathan lives in Yankeetown, for a place name is often a town in New England, and less often a ville or a burg, as in the South. He is a wizened little chip of a man with blue eyes and a bald head, and he looks frail enough for any northwest wind to blow away. But there is not a wind on this planet strong enough to blow Brother Jonathan off of his mountain farm. If any wind contrived to do so, he would climb right back again in the matter-of-fact way that Robert Frost describes in Brown's Descent. He would bow with grace to natural law, and then go round it on his feet. Brother Jonathan is past 70 years, and his wife Priscilla is well over 60, but between them they still manage to do most of the daily work, in house and field, for a 200-acre farm, most of which is in woodland and meadow. Nathaniel, their adopted son, helps some now and then, but Nathaniel, who is carpenter, mechanic, cabinet maker, mountain guide, and tax collector combined, is busy putting up the new house, into which he and Sophronia, his wife, will soon move. They are building it extra large, to take in summer boarders. Sophronia helps Priscilla as much as she can, but she has her own small children to look after. Later on, Brother Jonathan hopes to get a 12-year-old boy from the orphanage who will do the chores for his keep. But now, Brother Jonathan must be up at daylight to start the kitchen fire and milk the cows. If it is haying time, he is out in the meadow early with the mowing machine, which he has sharpened and greased with his own hands, or repaired at his own smithy if it needs repairing. The mower bumps and clicks through the rough meadow, tossing the little man to and fro as he warily skirts the outcrops of stone that will have to be circled with a scythe to get the last wisps of hay. Later, he changes the patient old horses from mower to wagon and starts in with a pitchfork. It is a sight to see him navigating the loaded wagon from the upper field to the barn, past jutting boulders and through deep ruts. But his pace is easy. He keeps it up all day without undue perspiration or agony, and after supper cuts his wood and milks his cows again in unruffled calm. He does not seem tired or bored. As he milks, he philosophizes to the listening stranger. Yes, times are not what they were, but a man can get along if he will be careful and honest. Foolish people, of course, never know how to manage. The harms all come from people of no character that do things without regard to common decency. The stars are shining when he takes the pails of milk into the kitchen. Under the hanging lamp, he reads the Burlington Free Press or the Pathfinder until he begins to nod. All the arrangements on Brother Jonathan's farm are neat and ingenious, the arrangements of a man who has had to depend largely on his own wit and strength. The barn is cleverly arranged in 2 stories, with a ramp entering the upper story for the convenience of Brother Jonathan and his hay wagon, and running water on the lower story for the convenience of the animals. One well near the barn is operated by a windmill. It supplies the stock. Another well, higher up, supplies the house, for Brother Jonathan has a bathroom in the upper hall and faucets in the kitchen. He has no telephone or electric lights. A man can dig and pipe his own wells, and they are furnished, but telephone and electric lights, not being home contrivances, require a never-ending tribute to Mammon. He has his own sawmill and his own workshop, where he can mend things without losing time and money on a trip to the village. His garage, occupied at present by Nathaniel's 4-year-old car, which is not being used, contains a carpenter's bench and a small gas engine, rigged to do sawing and turning, their pelts drying on the walls. The house is built to economize space and retain heat. For all its modest proportions, it is convenient and comfortable. The kitchen is spacious and well equipped. The pantry and cellar are stored with vegetables, fruits, and meats that Priscilla has put up with her own hands. The dining room, with its long table covered with spotless oilcloth, is eating room, living room, and children's playground combined. Here all gather after supper, the women with their tatting and embroidery, the lively, dark-eyed boy from the village with his homemade fiddle, a summer boarder or 2, or a visiting relative, and always Brother Jonathan with his newspaper. In one corner is a reed organ on which Brother Jonathan occasionally plays hymns. In another corner is a desk filled with miscellaneous papers, books, and old magazines. On the walls hang a glass frame containing butterflies, the gift of a wandering entomologist, an 1876 engraving of General Washington being welcomed in New York, with the pictures of all the presidents, up to Hayes, around the border, and a faded photograph of a mere youthful Brother Jonathan with his fellow baggage clerks, taken in the days when he went west and got a job in Chicago. Brother Jonathan talks of Chicago sometimes, but he never reveals why he, unlike many other Yankees, came back to Vermont. The temper of the household is a subdued and even pleasantness, which the loud alarms and excursions of the world do not penetrate very far. The progress of Nathaniel's new house, the next morning's arrangements for gathering vegetables and canning, what Brother Jonathan shall say in the speech he is to make at the approaching celebration of Timothy's gold wedding. Such topics take precedence over the epic contentions of Mr. Hoover and Mr. Roosevelt. Priscilla may go so far as to marvel that anybody can doubt the goodness of Mr. Hoover. She does not add, as well she might, that Mr. Roosevelt, as a Yorker, inherits the distrust of Vermont. Or Brother Jonathan may warm up to politics enough to announce his everlasting distrust of Licorice Al Smith, and to confess that, out of firm disapproval for vice, he has once or twice bolted the Republican ticket and voted for the Prohibition Party's candidate. But in the South, he supposes, he would be as good a Democrat as the next one. They are all curious about the South, about Negroes, and whether the Southern people still have hard feelings against the North. On this point, they seem a little anxious and plaintive. But the talk soon shifts to the Green Mountain Boys, from one of whom Brother Jonathan is descended, or to stories of his childhood, where bears were as thick as porcupines are now. He tells of how 7 bears were once killed in the same tree. Into these stories, Brother Jonathan may put a dry quip or two by way of garnishment. He has a store of homely jokes and extended metaphors, to which he frequently adds a humorous gloss to be sure the stranger gets the point. Then maybe there is a game of anagrams, or on another evening, a corn roast, and a few cronies and kinfolks from the village, who talk the clipped Yankee talk that seems, to Southern ears, as pure as English can be, with only a little of the twang that dialect stories have taught one to expect. Brother Jonathan is not dogmatic to the point of testiness, but he is firmly rationalistic on many points. He declares it incredible, for instance, that Catholics can believe in transubstantiation. How can bread and wine actually turn into the body and blood of Jesus Christ? Yet, oddly enough, Brother Jonathan is neither Congregationalist nor Unitarian, but Methodist, and does not mind repeating the Apostles' Creed with its formidable references to the Trinity and the resurrection. I am led to suspect that it is not the doctrine, but the authority to which Brother Jonathan is temperamentally hostile. He is used to depending on himself. He does not like to be told things. And his independence is of a piece with the whole conduct of his life. Years ago, when a famous local character eccentrically bought up all the surrounding woodland and farmland and turned it into a forest reserve, which he bequeathed to a neighboring college, Brother Jonathan did not sell out. He held on then, he holds on now, with a positiveness that would be the despair of communists. He will continue to hold on, as long as trees yield maple syrup, which he will never, never basely dilute with cane syrup, and boarders return, summer after summer. For Brother Jonathan belongs in spirit to the old republic of independent farmers that Jefferson wanted to see flourish as the foundation of liberty in the United States. To conserve that liberty, he has his own Yankee arrangements. The town, which the Southerner had to learn, consisted of a village and a great deal of contiguous territory up to the next town line, and the town meeting, at which Brother Jonathan can stand up and tell the government what he thinks about it. Of the uses of town meetings, Priscilla has something to say, which comes, I reflect, with a little feminine sauciness. A certain individual, she relates, was criticized for not painting the community house, as he had been employed to do, and when he excused himself on the ground that the paint was lacking, his own wife sprang up at the town meeting and cried, "Don't believe a word he says. The paint's setting in the cellar this minute." But the Southerner could reflect that such family intimacy might have civic advantages. Brother Jonathan's local government is composed of nobody more Olympic or corrupt than his own neighbors and relations. For him, it is not something off yonder, and he visualizes the national government, though a little too innocently, as simply an enlarged town meeting, where good management ought to be a matter of course. In Yankee Town, good management is a matter of course. It maintains a library. It looks after roads. It sees that taxes are paid and well spent. If the state government does not behave, Nathaniel himself will run for the legislature and see that it does behave. In all this, there was much for a Southerner to savor curiously and learn about, as he savored and learned about the strange food that appeared on Brother Jonathan's table. Doughnuts for breakfast, maple syrup on pie and cereal, the New England boiled dinner, the roasting ears that were really roasted in the old Indian fashion. Just as Brother Jonathan's menu suited the soil and the people, so his tidiness and responsibility suited the unobtrusive integrity of his character. With emphasis, one could say, Vermont is upright, vertical, and even yet Puritan. Why not? 4. And almost 2,000 miles away, with an unconcern about the state of the world that parallels but differs from Brother Jonathan's, Cousin Roderick of Rebelville is achieving another salvation, somehow not recorded in the auguries of socialistic planning. Autumn is beginning, the scuppernongs are ripe, and he invites everybody to come over and join him in the scuppernong arbor. In the late afternoon, a merry crew gather around the grapevine, laughing and bantering as they pick the luscious grapes and crush them against their palates. Sister Caroline is there, with a figure as trim and a wit as lively at 80 as it must have been at 20. Young cousin Hector and his wife are there. They are refugeeing from the industrial calamity that overtook them in a northern city. And there are numerous other vague cousins and sisters and children, all munching and passing family gossip back and forth between bites. Cousin Roderick's Dionysian laughter goes up heartiest of all among the leaves, and he moves to and fro, rapidly gathering grapes and pressing them upon the visitors. "Oh, you're not going to quit on us," he says. "You must eat more than that. Scuppernongs never hurt a soul." The scuppernong vine, he declares, is 100 years old and nearly always fruitful. But not so old, never so fruitful, puts in Sister Caroline, as the scuppernong vine at the old place, that as barefoot children they used to clamber over. Then the meeting is adjourned to Cousin Roderick's great front porch, where one looks out between white columns at sunset clouds piling up into the deep blues and yellows of a Maxfield Parish sky. Down the long street of Rebelville, between the mighty water oaks set out by Cousin Roderick's kin after the Confederate War, the cotton wagons are passing, heaped high with the white mass of cotton and a Negro or two atop. And the talk goes on, to the jingle of traced chains and the chop of mule hooves on the almost brand new state highway, which is so much better for rubber tires than for mule hooves. Over yonder lives Cousin Roderick's Aunt Cecily, a widow, a single, indomitable inhabitant of a stately mansion where economics has not yet prevailed against sentiment. Next door is Uncle Burke Roderick, a Confederate veteran who at 90 still drives his horse and buggy to the plantation each morning. He is the last survivor of three brothers who were named Pitt, Fox, and Burke after their father's 18th century heroes. All around, indeed, are the Roderick kin, for Cousin Roderick, whose mother married a Bertram, bears the family name of his mother's people, a numerous clan who, by dint of sundry alliances and ancient understandings, attend to whatever little matters need attention in the community affairs of Rebelville, where Jefferson's least government principle is a matter of course. Before supper or after, some of the kinfolks may drop in, for there is always a vast deal of coming and going and droppings in at Cousin Roderick's. As he takes his ease on the porch, Cousin Roderick looks to be neither the elegant dandy nor the out-at-elbows dribbler of tobacco juice that partisans have accredited to the Southern tradition. He is a fairly tall, vigorous man, plainly dressed, with the ruddiness of Georgia's sun and good living on his face. His eyes are a wrinkle at the corners, ready to catch the humor of whatever is abroad. His hand fumbles his pipe as he tells one anecdote after another in the country drawl that has about as much of Mark Twain and Sut Lovengood in it as it has of the elations and flatterings supposed to belong to Southern patrician speech. In fact, though he really is patrician, as the female members of his family can assure you, he does not look anything like the old colonel of legend, and in spirit he, too, belongs to the Jeffersonian constituency. He has something of the bearing of an English squire, and a good deal of the frontier heartiness that Augustus Baldwin Longstreet depicted in Georgia Scenes. He assumes that the world is good-humored and friendly until it proves itself otherwise. If it does prove itself otherwise, there is a glint in his eye that tells you he will fight. Cousin Roderick is the opposite of Chaucer's man of law, who ever seemed busier than he was. Cousin Roderick is busier than he seems. His air of negligence, like his good humor, is a philosophical defense against the dangerous surprises that life may turn up. Really, he is not negligent. He does not work with his own hands like Brother Jonathan or his Southern brothers of upcountry and bluegrass, but in the past he has worked aplenty with his hands and knows how it should be done. On his several tracts of land, the gatherings of inheritance and purchase, are some 150 Negroes, whom he furnishes housing, food, and a little money. They do his labor, men, women, children together. They are his hands. He is expected to call them by name, to get them out of jail, to doctor them, even sometimes to bury them, when lodge dues may have lapsed. They are no longer his slaves, but though they do not now utter the word, they do not allow him to forget that he has the obligations of a master. As Cousin Roderick makes the rounds of his fields, no more on horseback as of old, but in a battered Chevrolet, he sets forth his notions of economy. As for the Depression, that is no new thing in Rebelville. People here have got used to ruination. After the Confederate War came Reconstruction. After Reconstruction, Tom Watson and the populist turmoil of the 90s. A while later, the peach boom and its collapse, Then the Florida boom, with its devastation, and now this new depression. Like most of his kin, Cousin Roderick has simply retreated into the old plantation economy. He tells how, when he was a young fellow, just beginning to take charge, his father came out to the plantation one day and asked for a ham. Cousin Roderick explained that hogs were up to a good price. He had sold the entire lot on the hoof and had good money in the bank. Sir, said the old man, let me never again catch you without hams in your smokehouse and corn in your crib. You've got to make this land take care of itself. And that, says Cousin Roderick, is what I aim to do. From the land he feeds his own family, the 150 Negroes, and the stock. Whatever is left, when taxes and upkeep are deducted, is the profit. Anything that grows, he will plant: asparagus, peaches, pecans, onions, peppers, tomatoes, and of course the great staple crops: grain, hay, and cotton. Especially cotton, for no matter how low the price, cotton is money. It is ridiculous, he thinks, to talk of getting people who are hard up for money to reduce cotton acreage. For his part, Cousin Roderick intends to make every bale his land will produce. But if cotton fails, he can still sell cattle or cabbage or timber from his baronial holdings. Land is the only abiding thing, the only assurance of happiness and comfort. He wants more land, not less. One suspects that Cousin Roderick, however hard-pressed he may be at the bank, is fundamentally right. If he is not right, how does he manage, in these times, to send a daughter to college, and entertain his friends, and keep a cheerful face before the world? The portraits of his ancestors, looking down from their frames above great-grandfather's sideboard, or his wife's new grand piano, eternally assure Cousin Roderick that he is right. They won this Eden of sandy earth and red clay, where all things grow with a vigor that neither winter nor drought can abate. Not soon will their sun give it up. To the designs of experts who want to plan people's lives for them, Cousin Roderick gives no more than the indulgent attention of a naturally kind-hearted man. He reads the anxious thunderings of the young men who reproduce, in the Macon Telegraph, the remote dynamitical poppings of the new republic, and is unmoved. The young men are like the mockingbird who sat on the cupola of the courthouse while court was in session, and so learned to sing, "Prisoner, look upon the jury. Jury, look upon the prisoner. Guilty, guilty, guilty." It is a little incredible that so much planning should need to be done. Don't people know how they want to live? As for politics, long since it became tawdry and uncertain. Politics is for lawyers. Cousin Roderick would no more think of running for the legislature than he would think of moving to China. In that, perhaps he lamentably differs from his ancestors. But in Rebelville, political action is generally no more than a confirmation of what had been talked about around among the clans. If you really want things done, you speak quietly to cousin so-and-so and others that pass the word to everybody that counts. And then something is done. In Rebelville, the politics and economics of the bustling world become a faint whisper. All that matters is to see one's friends and relatives and pass from house to house, from field to field, under Georgia skies, to gather at a simple family dinner where only 3 kinds of bread and 4 kinds of meat are flanked by collards, sweet potatoes, corn, pickles, fruits, salads, jams, and cakes. Or at a barbecue for 50 or more, for which whole herds are slaughtered, it would seem, and entire pantries and gardens desolated. Or to sit with the wise men in front of the store, swapping jokes and telling tales, hour after hour. Or to hunt for fox, possum, coon, and quail in swamp and field. Or, for the ladies, to attend meetings of UDCs, DARs, and missionary societies, or church service, or district conference, or the tender ceremonies of Confederate Memorial Day, or the high school entertainment, or to hear the voices of Negroes sifting through the dust, or the mockingbird in moonlight, or to see the dark pines against sunset and the old house lifting its columns far away, calling the wanderer home. The scuppernongs are gone, the cotton is picked, but already the pecans are falling, and planting begins again, while late roses and chrysanthemums are showing, and even in the first frosts, the camellias are budding against their December flowering. What though newspapers be loud and wars and rumors threaten? It is only an academic buzzing that one must tolerate for manners' sake. Sowing and harvest go together, and summer runs into winter, and in Georgia one is persuaded to take the horizontal view. By some it may be said that dark clouds hang over Yankeetown and Rebelville, clouds of menace, maybe of destruction. I do not deny their presence, but my story is not of such clouds. In this strange modern world, it may be observed that men talk continually of the good life without producing a specimen of it to convince an inquirer. Brother Jonathan and cousin Roderick do not talk about the good life, they lead it. If government is intended to serve human interests, what does it propose to do about them? If science is really intelligent, what does it mean by conniving to put a stigma upon them or to destroy them? I cannot believe that a government or a science which ignores or depreciates them is very trustworthy. I believe that government and science will fail unless they are taken into account. They and others are the incarnation of the principles of diversity through which the United States have become something better than Balkan, and without which the phrase, my country, is but a sorry and almost meaningless abstraction.